Welcome to the CEC Report for the 6th of March 2015. I'm Elisa Barwick, and with me today is Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And on this week's show, dangerous information war against Russia leading to nuclear war, and more financial bubble trouble. So firstly, dangerous information war against Russia leading to nuclear war. Now, just as peace was finally holding for the moment in Ukraine, we've seen this assassination of a Russian opposition leader, Boris Nemtsov, on the 27th of February. He was gunned down on a bridge crossing the Moscow River. Of course, the media are almost universally blaming it on Putin in one way or another, directly or indirectly. And I just want to say from the outset that the target of this operation is Putin and the destabilisation of Russia. There's no two ways about it, although we don't know all the ins and outs. But the way it's being played is very clear. So the first thing we'll look at is who is Boris Nemtsov, because nothing adds up, actually, if you were to look at the theory that Putin or his forces were behind it. Because although Nemtsov is described as an opposition figure, he's not currently in the parliament. He's not like the Bill Shorten of the political situation over there, and he's somewhat has been a discredited personality. He was certainly no threat to Putin, and he was not even that popular. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, after this happened, he commented that compared with the popularity of Putin or the government as a whole, Boris Nemtsov's popularity was hardly greater than that of the average citizen. Now, of course, Putin's popularity rating is 87%. But even if you look at the other 13% that don't support Putin, only 2% oppose him outright. The other 11% merely criticise him for not being tough enough against the West and not supporting the Eastern Ukrainians enough, and so forth.
Well, that's a real dynamic there, Elisa, that you do have some really hardline elements inside Russia that are, these are former military men in the military of former military of Russia that are leading the fight of the autonomous republics against the Nazi regime in Ukraine. And these people are people that say, yes, literally have said that Putin's not being tough enough.
That's right. And Nemtsov, the reason he's somewhat discredited is that he was a big part of the Yeltsin government that after the fall of the Soviet Union and throughout the 1990s really ripped Russia apart with privatisation, which was a massive transfer of the wealth of the collective people of the Soviet Union into the hands of a very small and concentrated group of an oligarchy, which when Putin came into power, he took measures to begin to dismantle that and to begin to rebuild the economy, which had been very successful, and even with the sanctions, the reason they're withstanding them somewhat is because of what they've done economically. So that's the reason for the difference between Putin's popularity and that of someone like Nemtsov. So Putin would have exactly zero to gain from, knocking off this character. And you have to ask the question, well, who would have something to gain? Now, I just want to add before I come to you, Craig, that Putin actually predicted that this would happen at the height of the White Revolution, which was the building destabilisation of Russia to build towards a colour revolution to knock out Putin. This was February 2012, and Putin was describing the kind of clashes that were being promoted, and he said they're pushing for clashes. They're even prepared to sacrifice somebody and blame the authorities. They are even looking for a so-called sacrificial lamb, somebody famous. They would off him, excuse me for the expression, and then blame the authorities. Now, some of this was covered in an article, a very good article by Jacques Sapir, a French economist and Russian expert, on 3rd of March, called Who Framed Vladimir Putin? And he goes through in some detail what is known about the killing. He says it appears to be a professional or a contract murder. 8 shots were fired, 4 into his back from behind, so the shooter had presumably perfectly identified the target. This was done in the open air, not as you would expect at his home or in the stairwell of an apartment building. It was done virtually under the windows of the Kremlin, which makes it seem, as this author suggests, as a staged killing. because it's intended to implicate Putin in a direct fashion. Apparently there was a snowplower that was blocking the videos that do film the bridge in closed-circuit TV at the time, conveniently. Nemtsov's companion was unhurt, which is interesting given there were 8 shots fired and they're standing together. She's a Ukrainian actress and model. Sapir says that if the girl is involved in this, even if not directly and not in the intent, that would have necessitated deep connections into the Ukraine. And he then suggests that Vladimir Putin and the Russian government have immediately advanced the hypothesis of a provocation. And he said, look, it's easy to see the appeal for them of that hypothesis, but one must have the honesty to say that's what it is. Putin is actually the target of a deep and widespread hate campaign in the Western media. This is consistent with the war Western media are waging against Russia and Putin. And even the former US ambassador to the Soviet Union under Reagan, Jack Matlock, said, "It is simply difficult to imagine a location that could include more symbols of the Russian state. It looks like a frame-up." So what I wanted to ask you, Craig, because you know, there is the ceasefire is actually being successful at the moment. The Eastern Ukrainians are holding back. Even the government is to some extent removing heavy weaponry. But at the same time, you had the Deputy Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, Andriy Parubi, who's involved in these neo-Nazi networks we've identified in the Ukraine. He's been in the US pushing for America to arm the Ukrainian military with lethal weapons for the first time. And so, of course, in response to this entire event, Lyndon LaRouche stated that this smells like Nuland, meaning Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. What is the US involvement in this? What's the US role?
We have to go back and look at what the US themselves have said, either Victoria Nuland or even Obama. The fact is that they spent something like $5 billion funding 2,200 NGOs inside Ukraine in order to overthrow the government back last year, right? So the point is that why was this done? This was done in order to provide the context of a war against Russia, right? And you've got inside the Ukrainian government right now, you've got actually hardcore Banderite Nazis. And if people don't know what that is, they can get onto the website and look at some of our material and get themselves familiar with some of the background.
That was supportive of Hitler during World War II in Ukraine.
Yes, and see, this is the actual government you're dealing with in Ukraine. So the Eastern Ukrainians are saying we don't want to be part of a government which is full of Nazis, because the Ukraine, as part of Russia, part of the Soviet Union, played a crucial role in the defeat of fascism in World War II, which is coming up to the 100-year anniversary of, not the 100th, 70th year anniversary of. So here you have Victoria Nuland bragging that the US has been actively involved in funding actually these Nazi operations to overthrow a legitimate government. And now you've got, as you said, the Deputy Speaker of the Ukrainian House actively lobbying Obama for offensive weapons in the US.
At the very time when there's meant to be a ceasefire.
And the reason this is happening is because the entire global financial system is in the process of imploding. It's not a matter of is it happening or not happening. It is happening right now, and you only have to look and see what's happening with Greece to see that as a result of the austerity over the last decade or so, but in particular since the global financial crisis, and the austerity that's been imposed by the West through the Troika, European Bank, the European Union, and so forth, that there's a real reaction against that from the people. And we've got now a Greek government in place in Greece that are saying no more austerity, no more of these conditionalities put onto us by the Troika. In concert with that, and behind the scenes, but not so much behind the scenes if you study what's going on, you have this alliance of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that are moving towards an entirely different new just world economic order. And this is based upon the idea of national sovereignty. Now, national sovereignty is an idea that the West hates. I mean, Tony Blair invented this doctrine called the responsibility to protect, which is why he lied about what was taking place with Saddam Hussein, and the West went in there and destroyed Iraq. It's the same doctrine of why they went in and destroyed Gaddafi. Oh, we see that these these leaders are doing something wrong with their population, therefore we have the responsibility to protect those populations. We go in there and we destroy, in effect, the sovereignty of those nations.
And the whole country's economy in the process.
And so what you see with the expression of what Putin has done since 2000, since coming to power, is that he has been fiercely pro-national sovereignty, the development of Russia, as much as he can within inside the confines of the internal dynamics of the Russian politics. So he has gone out and he stood up for the people, and people have recognised that, and as they've done in Greece, they say, we want this leader. You know, 83% of people, 87% of people support him. That sort of reflects back on Abbott, why only 23% of people support Abbott. I mean, it's because Abbott represents the very forces that Obama represents, that Newland represents, right, that are promoting this policy of globalisation, of free trade, and the destruction of nation states. Now, he must deny that, but this is where these policies lead to.
And I just wanted to raise this doctrine of limited nuclear warfare, because as you've made it clear, Putin is going to defend Russia, and they are not going to back down to whatever threat is posed. But there's people in the West that believe that they could make limited nuclear strikes or strikes against Russia's nuclear arsenal and take out Russia's capability to retaliate in a bigger war. And so they believe that they could limit a nuclear war to a contained region, just to Eurasia, for example. And of course, this is a complete fantasy, but the US is proceeding on that basis to upgrade their 180 tactical nuclear weapons that are based in Europe, in Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy and Turkey. And they'll be able to have a high degree of precision so they can target Russian arsenals. They can basically penetrate further into Russian territory, and they can be delivered on stealth fighter planes. So what is this insanity, Craig?
That's what it is. It is insanity. I mean, here you have the West saying, oh, we've now got the capability to have a limited nuclear war. We're going to confine it to Eurasia, right? India, China, Russia, because what do they represent? You've got the major BRICS countries there. This represents a total strategic financial threat to the West, and therefore they think that they can do this. But see, Elisa, a lot of this weaponry is automated. There's certain preconditions are met because of the rapidity of which they have to react in the first place. This is on a hair trigger.
That's right.
And there's no such thing as limited nuclear war. There's something like 16,000 nuclear warheads. 8,000 of those are in Russia, 6,500 roughly are in the United States, and the balance amongst other countries. But once this process happens, as we've said many, many times, it's not going to be just a tit for tat. It's going to be an all-out nuclear holocaust.
Exactly. And the head of the Central Command Post of the Strategic Missile Forces in Russia said that our units are geographically deployed in such a way that no global strike is capable of disabling the entire force. So we're going to stop there, but we'll keep talking about this subject after the break. Welcome back to the CEC Report. We're discussing dangerous information war against Russia leading to nuclear war. And so we just talked about the impact of this assassination of Boris Nemtsov in Russia. But I want to come to the Australian role in this currently, because Tony Abbott just announced on the 3rd of March that we'll be sending another 300 or so troops into Iraq. And this was announced, this was by request of the United States that this happened, and Abbott even used Obama's words in his press conference announcing this, where he demanded that the death cult be disrupted, degraded and ultimately destroyed. So you can see on whose initiative this is taking place. Now, Abbott justified it by claiming that attacks on police in Melbourne and the Sydney siege all, quote, were inspired by the death cult, unquote. But as we've made clear in recent programs in the last even 3 or 4 shows of the CEC Report, there's really no evidence of that apart from his claims, the flag that was held up during the Sydney siege, which is really more of a generic Islamic flag. That it was more really about Monis was using that tactic really just to draw attention, to get the kind of attention that he wanted because of having been cut off contact from his children and so forth, as we know. Now, I want to add to that, though, that a source has informed the CEC that the New South Wales Police were intending on negotiating with Monis as a regular hostage situation in the first place, and that's how they were proceeding, and that's why they were talking to this particular source. However, at a certain point, Tony Abbott declared that this was a terrorist attack linked to ISIS, and the source was then told at that time that all negotiations were off because we don't negotiate with terrorists. And again, there was no proof that it was a terrorist attack, it was just Abbott's having declared it that changed the whole situation and is probably what led to the outcome being as bad as it was. So the crucial element is to establish that the Sydney siege was Islamic State inspired or run, because that's the justification both to expand this war in Iraq against ISIS, which is completely useless, and we'll get to that in a minute, it won't work, but also to get the support necessary to get through the new anti-terror laws on the metadata collection, because the Labor Party wasn't necessarily going to support that. But now with the Sydney siege, oh well, we have to track everything, we have to watch everyone. Now I want to refer to an article that's just been published in the West Australian on this subject by an academic from Murdoch University, Amir Ali. He's also the former president of the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils. And he is unique because he correctly identifies the financial largesse of the Saudis behind Islamic State, and he identifies the release of the missing 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report as crucial to actually stopping Islamic State. He said to attack the ideology of IS is to attack the ideology of its foster parent, Saudi Arabia, and its brand of Islam. Even the US and its allies are not prepared to make Saudi Arabia accountable for the damage its brand of Islam has caused. Why is the US still not declassifying the 28 pages of the Joint Congressional Inquiry report into the 9/11 attacks? There is dishonesty everywhere, and IS will thrive by default. Tougher laws in place like Australia may even toughen the resolve of Muslim youngsters to join IS. So clearly what Abbott is doing can backfire.
Lisa, the truth is on the screen now for viewers to look at. We published an article on page 4 of our last New Citizen, Prince Charles of Arabia. And what we identify there is what the 9/11 missing pages actually point to. The fact that the British, through with their very close collaboration with the Saudis, via the royal family themselves, and deals like Al Yamama, which is a weapons for oil deal by the British going back into the Margaret Thatcher regime, has created the money necessary to fund all the different terrorist operations in the world today. So all this sideshow that Tony Abbott goes on about is avoiding the issue. Unless you go after this funding source of terrorism from the top, and we've identified in this article that this comes directly from the Crown through Prince Charles and so forth, that you will not stop this terrorist problem, or you won't stop ISIS by simply trying to do what Tony Abbott has been doing. That's the hard reality. Now people should get a copy of our material and also go and look on page 2 or page 3 where we actually forecast that this accident, sorry, not an accident, but incident was not an accident. It was going to happen because of the role of the intelligence agencies. And on this program, on our website, we go back and you can follow the discussion that we've been having as the information's being unfolding about the truth of what this actually Sydney siege was. That it sounds, from what you said, which is correct, the police were going to treat it like a normal hostage situation, but there was political interference for political reasons, and we've seen this before, time and time again. When the government wants more powers to control everyone, it brings in it wants the power to bring in legislation that people say, oh, we need this now because of such and such, when in fact we don't need it. It's just simply another way of bringing in police state measures.
And they particularly need it to deal with the worsening economic situation, which we're going to talk about next after this short break. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So now we're discussing more financial bubble trouble. So this is about a new expected coming shock to the financial system. Now there's been an article that was published on the 4th of March in the Australian Financial Review which admits some of what we've been saying for some time. This article was by Bianca Harcht-Hazelman and it's titled Asset Bubbles Put Investors at More Risk Than GFC, which somewhat says it all. But just to go through some of the main points that she puts forward, she says the stock market and property bubble are set to burst, especially at the first signs of a rise in interest rates. She says the real economy is going in the completely opposite direction to where the markets are going, a sure sign of a looming crash. She says prices of shares are massively overinflated compared to what you can earn from those shares, as shown by soaring price to earnings ratios. She says that median property prices in both Sydney and Melbourne are at all-time highs, but that investment will not be met by justifiable returns. And she quotes the Baillieu Holst equity analyst, Mathan Somasundram, who points out that with interest rates so low and the Australian dollar falling towards US 70 cents, that Australia has no buffers any longer in the event of a new global shock. And she quotes him saying, "We are driving very fast without seatbelts. Once we use up these buffers and are sitting on asset bubbles, any macro headwind will hammer us even harder than the GFC." Now, of course, this is exactly what we've been saying for some time, for many years since the GFC. We said then, this is not the end of it. It ain't over. Until we correct the problem, it won't be over. Of course, nothing has changed really since the GFC, except for all that the bad practices that led us into that disaster have gotten worse. Australia's derivatives have doubled, etc. What can we expect, Craig, and what do we need to do instead?
Well, Elisa, also up in Queensland on Wednesday, and we had a rather large meeting of people. A lot of those people were CEC, Channel 44 viewers, which was very good to see. And one of the constant questions that came up was this question of where do I put my money, right? What banks are the safest? But what was also very good was a lot of people were saying we absolutely need to have Glass-Steagall because they can see that this system's out of control. And there's two ways the financial system can be dealt with. Either you have this catastrophe with this sort of collapse based upon what this journalist is talking about, which is going to be uncontrolled and completely out of control, or you go with what we call the Glass-Steagall, which is a metaphor, it's an idea, it's a name for a process which was adopted by Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, where he had the same problem. So he said, no, we've got to separate out the commercial banking system. We need our local bankers, we need our local banks to fund mortgages and so forth. We need a stable banking system for commerce. What we don't need is all the investment banking, merchant banking, stockbroking houses, insurance houses, and so forth, all bundled up so that you have these two big to fail banks. So we need to separate those out, separate out the ownership so they're completely separate. And we need to do that in a rather ordered way. We also have to have what we've called for is a debt moratorium across the board. Many, many people have already paid back their debts because of the high interest rates over the last 10 or so years, particularly in farms. We've got to keep farmers on the land, and we have to develop our agricultural and our manufacturing sector. That means you've got to deal with the question of debt and what debts have been paid. So there's numerous different policies that we have to put in place, but unless it's done in an orderly way, which is what we're talking about, and now, then you're going to get hit by a headwind, and we're going to see a cyclonic type force bring down the financial system, and the ordinary people are going to be the sufferers of this. That's why we need to have an orderly transition. We need Glass-Steagall, we need debt moratorium, but we need governments to act in the interest of the people first and foremost, and not the mega banks that are making mega profits.
And we need to return to national banking to fund development, which the good news also I wanted to mention is that Russia and India have ratified in their parliaments in the last week or so the mechanisms to start the National Development Bank. So thanks for tuning into the CEC Report, and join us again next week.